Where we're going, we don't need Thunderbolt. I'm playing on a Minisforum machine. 150 FPS, 1440p native, Doom Eternal. But no, I'm not playing on the internal GPU. I'm playing on the external GPD G1. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, this has got USB 4, which is basically Thunderbolt. You can use an eGPU dock. No. This is much faster than Thunderbolt. More than twice as fast for some things. It really is something special. Let's take a closer look. The GPD G1 is an Oculink external graphics card. It's the 7600M XT. It's just another eGPU, right? It's the G1, it's a 7600M. It's not even upgradable. There's not a PCIe slot. Why would you want this? Because it's got Oculink, in addition to Thunderbolt 4. Alright, I probably should start by filling you in on a few things about Thunderbolt 4. Thunderbolt 4 and Thunderbolt 3, basically the same thing. Really, the difference under the hood between Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 has nothing to do with the data layers, the interface speed. Well, a couple of non-optional features, but Thunderbolt 3 already was implementing a lot of the optional features. Most manufacturers were implementing the optional features long time ago. Thunderbolt 3 is advertised as like a 40 gigabit solution. It's going to give you up to 40 gigabits. That's basically the same as 4 PCIe 3.0 lanes. And for some things, you can basically get the same amount of bandwidth. But for other things, it's a little trickier to get that amount of bandwidth. If you're using it for block storage, for example, you can get that, but generally you won't on Mac computers and most Windows computers without really jumping through a lot of hoops, partly because of the DMA engine, partly because of the implementation of the Thunderbolt chipset, which almost all Thunderbolt chipsets are Intel. Like the Thunderbolt name is Intel. Intel will not let you call it Thunderbolt unless you pay Intel to certify it as Thunderbolt. But under the hood, one of the features of Thunderbolt is PCIe tunneling, being able to take PCIe devices from one place to another, basically. Thunderbolt 3 and 4 in 2023 is absolutely anemic. And the fact that Thunderbolt 5 is not out yet, even though it's already advertised, it's like, oh, it's an 80 gigabit solution. It's up to 120 gigabit in one direction. What most people don't realize is that these Type-C cables, the reason they're reversible is because the top and bottom half of the cable actually has the same connections. And so when you plug it in and then you plug in the other side, it doesn't matter because there's two sets of connections there. You may have seen like 20 gigabit as 2x 10 gigabit on the USB side of things. And that's simply just two USB connections in one end. Some of you have even seen these funky cables you can get at some of the markets in Taiwan where it's a USB-C into two Type-A. And all that cable does is take the connections on the top and the bottom part of the port and route it out to two different USB ports. Not all USB Type-C ports are implemented that way on motherboards, but a lot of the time to save costs and complexity, that Type-C header really is two Type-A ports that are wired to the top and bottom half of the cable, but you only use one at a time. Not everything is that way. There are some things where it legit is just one connection and it can electrically route it between the top and the bottom half of the connector. But at least for the 2x10 gigabit connections, it really is two 10 gigabit USB connections. By the same token, Thunderbolt, the original Thunderbolt 3 specification, actually allowed up to 8 PCIe lanes in this wire, which is wild. The reason that you don't see that very much is it is very difficult to get certification. You see, that type of a layout with that many wires in your cable and that much going on in a tiny little USB-C connector generates a lot of RF interference. Not just for other devices, but even for other radios that exist in your device. So if you wanted to have an 8-lane Thunderbolt setup, for example, that would run at 80 gigabit instead of 40 gigabit. It's the equivalent of 8 PCIe lanes because there really are 8 channels on the wire, as there are 4 channels with Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 on the wire. Well, 4 channels plus there's a lower bandwidth side channel, but let's not be super pedantic. But in a nutshell, know that on the physical USB-C wire, there's 4 high-speed pair, and that's what's doing all the heavy lifting. And the specification does actually allow for up to 8 high-speed pair, and you do have 8 high-speed pair in a 2x10 gigabit USB Type-C cable. So a theoretical implementation of double-sided Thunderbolt, you could see an 80 gigabit connection. Intel has actually demoed that in the lab. Some of their, it's like, oh, look at this, it's 80 gigabit Thunderbolt. It's actually just double-sided Thunderbolt. The new Thunderbolt that's coming, that is 80/120 gigabit, is actually a higher rate of speed. They're not going into the whole 8-pair thing. They might be able to do 8-pair in the future for some sort of something, but Thunderbolt 5 is not there yet. And for my opinion, I don't think 80 gigabit up and down or 120 gigabit out and 40 gigabit back is enough of an upgrade. That's just sad. How you know Thunderbolt 3 and 4 is not enough is manufacturers like GPD and Minisforum are adding Oculink to their devices. Now, strictly speaking, Oculink is already an obsolete connector. It's on its way out. Oculink has its origins in servers, and it is a 4-lane connection. There are 8-lane versions. Actually, I think as far as that goes, I think there was even a 16-lane version. But I've seen 4 and 8-lane versions in the wild in servers for cabling up drive backplanes and just moving PCIe lanes around. You see internal server connections for network cards, high-speed storage, FPGAs, network cards, more different kinds of network cards, GPUs. It's all about PCIe lane routing. Sometimes you got to do that with a cable. Sometimes you got to do that with a printed circuit board. Sometimes you got to do that with a combination of a cable that goes to a printed circuit board and then turns the cable back into a PCIe slot, because you physically need to route devices somewhere that you can physically cool them. So you got to get creative in server design. So Oculink. You also don't have a lot of room on motherboards for physical connectors or slots. And so again, Oculink saves the day. Oculink is being supplanted right now because of Gen 5 PCIe. It was too hard to get Gen 5 and Gen 6 speeds working on that Oculink connector. It's being replaced with something called Mini Cool Edge, MCIO. But there's a lot of Oculink connections in the channel. And so, yeah, it's not a reversible connection, and it's not even a connection that can deliver power. It's not a connection that supports side channel, so it literally just carries PCIe. But boy, does it carry PCIe well, and it carries Gen 4 PCIe. Gen 4, yes, 80 gigabit. So you can experience what it's like to have Thunderbolt 5, at least the external GPU part of it, not the USB part or the display tunneling or some of the other stuff, right now today, directly with Oculink. And that is what the GPD G1 gives us. You can get Oculink PCIe docks as well. None that are as nice and sexy as the G1, but you can do that. And it actually is going to cost less. The G1, this is a device that I paid for. I actually paid for the G1 and the Minisforum 2023. But this is a video mainly about the G1 on a Minisforum machine. But I also have the GPD WinMax 2023, and which also has Oculink, and we have some other stuff. If you order the G1, it comes with an M.2 to Oculink adapter. And so you can use that with pretty much anything. You can use that with a laptop. My System 76 laptop that has 2 M.2, it'd be super awkward, but you could use this external GPU even with that laptop, as long as you have an M.2 that is accessible. It is a little bit janky. There is the jank factor, but it is a doable thing that you can run. For this setup, I've got the GPD G1 connected only by an Oculink cable to our Minisforum UM790 XTX. And that was Doom Eternal that I was enjoying at 150 FPS. And it basically works as advertised. It's an external GPU, a 7600M XT, that is unconstrained thermally and with power because it's in an external enclosure. It was originally designed for a laptop. There's actually some really interesting software stuff that goes on with that we should talk about, because AMD tries to do a power budget like as if these were in one combined system, and it does a really amazing job with that. But if you have a non-AMD system, this is just a PCIe device. It's going to work fine. You can install the Adrenaline drivers. It'll work in an Intel system. Hell, it'd probably work on an ARM system. I don't have an ARM system with an M.2 thing to test. We're going to get this thing running on RISC-V? We'll see. Have to mail the whole thing to Jeff Geerling, probably. But all of this is background for you to really just bring you up to speed on where we are with PCIe connectivity outside of a normal-looking PCIe slot. Oculink was what was chosen. And I sort of joked with the Intel Thunderbolt 5 guys. I met the Intel Thunderbolt 5 guys at Innovation, and I just sort of said, it's like, you guys have been so long in the tooth coming with the next generation Thunderbolt successor that we're using Oculink connectors. These physical connectors, like the people that manufacture the Oculink connector, they don't really rate them for the number of insertions that you can get with USB-C connections. A lot of these USB-C connectors start at 10,000 insertions and go up to like 100,000 500,000 insertions on this connector. If you if you have a cell phone that has a Type-C connection and you plug it into charge every day, you can definitely vouch for the fact that, wow, these connectors are only rated for a couple of hundred insertions, it seems. It depends. It depends on which vendor and which model that you get and how thick the gold plating is. There's a lot that goes into it. A lot of these Oculink connectors are only rated at 1/10 of the number of insertions that their USB-C counterparts are. Similarly, the cable the Minisforum bundles with the G1 is intended for use internally inside a server. This cable was not intended to be used outside of a nice protective chassis. I mean, sure, it's got a braided exterior, but this thin plastic braided exterior and then the foil wires underneath it is really all that separates this thing from chaos. This connector was not meant to be bent or pulled. This connector was not meant to be inserted more than probably 50 times. And this length of cable, quite frankly, is a problem for PCIe Gen 4 signaling speeds. You see, even though GPD designed the redrivers on the side of this to be able to deal with this long of a cable, most of the time it's really borderline. You want to use a cable that's about half this length. So this is 100 centimeters? You really want to use a 50 centimeter Gen 4 rated Oculink cable. And in fact, you'll have to run GPU-Z. If you buy one of these and set it up, you run GPU-Z and see and verify that it's linking up at Gen 4 speeds. A lot of the time for auto negotiation with a cable like this, it's only going to link up at Gen 3 speeds. If you've got a particularly good system, it will actually link up. The GPD WinMax 2023 generally will link up at Gen 4 with our 100 centimeter cable. But I have an older GPD machine that putting in the M.2, it will not link at Gen 4 with this longer cable. I have to use a shorter cable, and then it'll link fine. But it'll link up at Gen 3, and it'll work at Gen 3. You just won't get dramatically better performance than Thunderbolt. But it is better performance at Gen 3 via Oculink than Gen 3 via Thunderbolt, because 40 gigabits is not always equal to 40 gigabits. You see, you got pure PCIe bandwidth versus Thunderbolt bandwidth, where some of the bandwidth is reserved for other things like USB. And that's the other thing. I mentioned it, but just to be clear, there's no USB side channel. There's no power side channel. There's none of that. This is just a PCIe connection. Fortunately, both the G1 and the GPD devices have stuff in them. So if you connect Thunderbolt and Oculink, it'll still try to use the Oculink connection. And then you've got a fallback for USB. So this thing's got USB ports on it, but the USB ports and the memory card reader are not going to work unless you have a USB channel going back to the host device. So when I only had the Oculink cable plugged into our 780 XTX from Minisforum, none of those USB ports are going to work. I'm literally only going to get DisplayPort out at HDMI. And yes, because this is a full GPU, you can drive 3 external displays, full fat 144 hertz. No problem with this external GPU because the GPUs are connected. In fact, if you've got a mobile device like this, you can actually do the rendering there and then send the signal back to the device. That uses some of your bandwidth, so it'll hurt performance very slightly, but it is a much lower fraction of the overall bandwidth in Oculink PCIe Gen 4 mode than it is in Thunderbolt Gen 3 mode. If you're used to doing research and homework and looking at an external GPU solution, it's like, oh, if we send it to the GPU and then the rendering of the GPU back to the internal laptop display, that's slower than having a display connected to the GPU and the eGPU dock. It's much less noticeable with a Gen 4 Oculink because it's twice as fast, but you still do have a little bit of a performance hit. Whereas with the G1, you can just plug it in and it works. It's also not as remotely plug and play. To be sure, PCIe can be hot plug a little bit. Not as hot plug as USB 4, but still fairly hot plug. In this case, surprise removal of the GPU crashed the whole system. Now, like I say, these are AMD systems, AMD mobile, blah, blah, blah. And AMD has done some really amazing special things in their driver for AMD systems, but at the end of the day, this is a PCIe device. It'll work just the same on an Intel system. Okay, actually, it won't work quite as well on an Intel system owing to the fact that AMD has done a lot of plumbing with the driver and the setup. You see, normally, AMD thinks the setup is going to be used in a laptop. So the driver does make some assumptions to do with the power mode of the CPU and the GPU. And so if you do things like set your power limit in Adrenaline, that will affect the CPU power and the GPU power. You see, it'll try to budget power between the two of them, depending on the parameters that you set. In this case, it's not actually relevant, and that behavior in the future may change. But if you set 100 watts, for example, it'll try to use 100 watts between the two systems, even though the G1 has external power, as does our Minisforum desktop machine. It's a really interesting situation because a lot of the time in a laptop, the cooling solution is shared so that the CPU and the GPU have, basically a heat pipe connection to the same heatsink or set of heat sinks. That's way not the case here, but that's not something that AMD really takes into account in their software. They just look at it and say, yes, you get the AMD CPU, you get the AMD GPU. All right, sounds good. And that can affect your game performance and some other stuff. If you have an Intel system, you're adding this to an Intel system, or you've, added an Oculink M.2 adapter, which is all that's in our 780 XTX. It's just a slightly different flavor of M.2 to Oculink than what physically comes with the G1. But the fact that I'm able to combine Minisforum and GPD products, which they're kind of competitors, kind of not. I mean, they're in the small form factor PC, more like full handheld, like micro laptop versus micro desktop. But it's interesting that their products work so well together because this works really shockingly well. Like the 7600M XT is a lot of GPU horsepower combined with something as powerful as the 780 XTX. 150 FPS at 1440p in Doom is pretty darn good. Now, just because it's Oculink doesn't mean you can't use it in Thunderbolt mode, because GPD knows that there's a lot of devices out there that still only have Thunderbolt. So you can use this as a Thunderbolt eGPU. And the 7600M, when we're talking about this much graphics horsepower, is right on the edge for what's useful. Like, you wouldn't put, a 6900 XT at the end of a Thunderbolt connection because it's going to severely bottleneck by that anemic 40 gigabit interface between the GPU and the system. Doubling that for Oculink, that's going to change the game. You could run a really high-end GPU off of an Oculink dock. That's a possibility. And it will bottleneck a little bit, but not as severely as Thunderbolt 3. I mean, Thunderbolt 3, man, it's 10 years old. It was obsolete 2-3 years ago. I mean, 10 years, what other piece of technology has lasted 10 years, or what other aspect of technology is? Thunderbolt 5 is going to be obsolete before it even comes out if they're not careful. I mean, you really need like 160/160 or like 200/80. That's the ballpark where the bandwidth should be if that thing is going to be expected to last another 10 years. But I digress. The 7600M XT is a good choice for the Thunderbolt 3/4/Oculink crossover point, because when we're talking 1080p, 1440p, in some cases 4K, for a game that's super optimized like Doom Eternal, you're going to have a reasonable 4K play experience on the 7600M XT, which is mind-blowing to me that, this thing on my desk here that is playing a game consuming maybe 100 watts, and it's as good of an experience as it is, as quiet as it is, and low power as it is, that can run 3 displays, really is something. That you can do that through the Oculink interface is really nice. Now, could you run a higher-end GPU through Oculink? Yes. And it not bottleneck? It's getting there. Like a 7800 XT is going to bottleneck a little bit through an Oculink interface because it's still only 4 lanes at the end of the day. So 7600M XT, I kind of get it. The price for what it is kind of high and kind of not. On the side of the price is kind of high for the G1. That's not expandable. This GPU is going to be obsolete in a year or two. Well, not obsolete, but it's going to age in a year or two. It's not really upgradable or replaceable. $800 today is kind of a lot of money. It would be nice if there were some upgrade path where you could swap the GPU or a module or something. You get that with a PCIe eGPU. And there probably are some sketchy eGPU PCIe adapters out there. You could probably fashion and DIY something. And this, with the Oculink interface, is already a little bit sketchy because of the cable and the connector and rated insertions and so on and so forth. With the Thunderbolt 4 connection, that really does sweeten the pot because you've got an alternative interface you can use if something ever does go wrong with Oculink, or you can't get an Oculink adapter, or the Oculink adapter is just not stable enough for you, or you want to be able to more easily hot plug between devices, then you might have an easier time with Thunderbolt 4. Those are really the downsides. The upsides are this is a unique, innovative product in the market. There's Oculink is filling a void because we were overdue for a Thunderbolt replacement a long time ago. And it is really Thunderbolt adjacent, not a true Thunderbolt replacement, because it doesn't have the USB functionality. Yes, you can send the display output back over PCIe. That part works. Basically, nothing else does. You don't get charging. You don't get USB side channel. You don't get any of that. So you would have to run two connections, the Oculink plus some kind of a USB connection to your G1 in order to get the USB parts of it to work correctly if you're going to use it as some sort of a dock. And the power delivery on this is really not sufficient to charge a lot of higher-end laptops. The power delivery on the G1, if I'm doing something with the GPU, is not sufficient really even to charge the battery on our WinMax 2023. In running Linux on this, I can be doing enough background tasks and light gaming that the battery on the WinMax 2023 will slowly discharge even when it's connected to the Thunderbolt port on the GPD G1. In fact, GPD seems to recommend that you connect their stock bundled power brick to your WinMax 2023 laptop, as well as the USB connection plus the external power brick of the G1. So you've got two power plugs that you're occupying, plus the USB connection, plus the Oculink connection. And that does work great, and that is stable, and that's fine, and there's no complaints there. So something to keep in mind. This also works astonishingly well under Linux to be kind of as bleeding edge as it is, because at the end of the day, it's just a PCIe device. So AMD GPU and all of the features of the Linux kernel that support AMD GPUs works really well. You can even use Ryzen Adjust, which is a nice command line utility for doing your power budget stuff. And the power budget stuff basically works the way that you would expect, which is pretty awesome. One of the features that is a little sketchy on the Minisforum machine is you can't force Gen 3 or Gen 4 mode. You're left to auto detect. And even with my short cable, sometimes if this cable was close to, a power cable or something like that, it would still detect at Gen 3 mode. There was no way to force it. Whereas GPD learned that lesson, and they now expose a BIOS setting that's like, on the Oculink port, always force Gen 4. And it will always force Gen 4. Sometimes that can lead to stability issues, but generally, it's basically fine. Minisforum has not yet learned that lesson in terms of BIOS features and updates, but they're getting there. If they keep being successful in selling a lot of these, enough of you will complain about BIOS updates and BIOS features that they'll start rolling those features into the BIOS. Trust me. So there you have it. That's the GPD G1 in a nutshell. And yes, it'll work just fine on non-GPD devices. How about that? It's just Oculink. It could run in a server. It's going to appear in all sorts of weird videos where we're shoving PCIe where it doesn't belong, because that's what we do here at Level 1. I'm Wendell signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums. If you have any ideas for a project or something you want me to test, hit me up there. All right, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.